when Lieutenant Robert Henderson of the Royal Canadian Army unbuttoned his own winter coat on a freezing December morning in 1943 and draped it over the shoulders of a shivering German prisoner who'd just arrived at a processing camp in northern Ontario wearing only a thin summer uniform. The dozen other German POWs watching the scene stood in stunned silence because everything they'd been taught about Allied cruelty and Canadian weakness suggested this act of kindness was impossible. What those prisoners didn't know was that Henderson's gesture would become one of thousands of similar moments across Canadian POW camps during World War II. Small acts of human decency that would challenge Nazi ideology more effectively than any propaganda campaign and transform enemies into advocates for reconciliation who would spend their post-war lives building bridges between nations that had tried to destroy each other. The story begins not with exceptional heroism, but with ordinary humanity persisting in extraordinary circumstances. In a war where ideology demanded hatred, but where individual choices could demonstrate that compassion transcended national boundaries, and that the enemy could choose mercy when cruelty would have been easier and perhaps more satisfying. The winter of 1943-44 was particularly brutal across northern Canada, with temperatures regularly dropping to -30 degrees Celsius and winds that created conditions capable of causing frostbite within minutes of exposure. The German prisoners arriving at Camp 21 near Kapuskasing, Ontario, had been captured in various theaters of war. Many from the North African campaign, where they'd been fighting in desert heat. Others from Sicily and southern Italy, where Mediterranean climates had required only light uniforms. The logistics of prisoner transport meant that men captured in warm climates were often shipped to Canada. Without adequate consideration for the northern winter they'd encounter upon arrival, a bureaucratic oversight that created genuine medical emergencies as prisoners stepped off trains into Canadian winters, wearing uniforms designed for completely different conditions. The cold was unlike anything most German soldiers had experienced. Even those who'd served on the Eastern Front had encountered dry cold that was brutal but different from the penetrating damp cold of northern Ontario that seemed to cut through clothing and reach into bones. Lieutenant Henderson was a logistics officer, responsible for processing incoming prisoners, a position that required administrative competence, but that hadn't prepared him for the ethical choices he'd face when men arrived in his care, suffering from exposure. Henderson had grown up on a farm in rural Manitoba, had enlisted in 1940 more from sense of duty than from hatred of Germans, and had been assigned to POW camp administration because his civilian experience with farm management and logistics made him valuable for organizing camp operations. He'd seen plenty of prisoners pass through his processing station, but the batch that arrived on December 18, 1943, included a young German soldier named Joseph Bauer, who was literally turning blue from cold. His lips purple and his hands shaking so violently he couldn't hold the processing paperwork. Bauer had been captured near Naples in September wearing a lightweight summer uniform, had spent weeks in British POW facilities in North Africa and Italy, and had crossed the Atlantic in ship holds where temperatures were controlled, but where he'd had no warning that he was being sent to northern Canada in winter. The decision Henderson made in that moment was simple and instinctive. Bauer would die or suffer serious cold injury if he didn't get warm immediately, and the camp supply depot wouldn't have winter coats available until the next supply delivery in several days. Henderson's own military-issue winter coat was regulation Canadian Army equipment. Heavy wool with a fur-lined collar, designed to keep soldiers functional in Arctic conditions. Taking it off meant Henderson would be cold, but he was processing prisoners indoors and could manage with multiple layers. Giving it to an enemy prisoner violated no specific regulation, but definitely violated the informal hierarchies that typically governed captor-prisoner relationships. Guards and other officers watching the interaction expected Henderson to send Bauer to the camp infirmary wrapped in blankets, the standard response to cold-related emergencies. Instead, Henderson removed his coat, walked over to the shivering German, and placed it around his shoulders, speaking in English that Bauer didn't understand. but using gestures and tone that communicated concern rather than hostility. The other German prisoners witnessing this scene had been conditioned by years of Nazi propaganda to expect harsh treatment from Allied captors, particularly from Canadians who Nazi materials portrayed as primitive colonials, barely capable of governing themselves, let alone managing prisoners. The propaganda had painted detailed pictures of Allied brutality, prisoners being tortured for information, starved systematically, and worked to death in conditions resembling slave labor. These prisoners had seen evidence contradicting some of this propaganda since their capture. The adequate food and medical care suggesting Allied treatment was better than advertised, but many still harbored suspicions that the decent treatment was temporary or designed to weaken their resolve. Watching a Canadian officer literally give the coat off his back to a German prisoner shattered these expectations so completely that several prisoners would later describe experiencing something like cognitive vertigo, the disorienting sensation of discovering fundamental beliefs were wrong. Joseph Bauer survived that first day in Canada because of Henderson's coat. Warming gradually in the processing building while camp administration scrambled to find additional winter clothing for the new arrivals, Bauer would spend nearly 3 years in Canadian captivity, eventually working on farms in southern Ontario where winters were less severe, but where he'd always remember that first encounter with Canadian winter and with Canadian kindness. In letters Bauer wrote to his family in Bavaria, carefully censored by camp authorities but preserved in family archives, he mentioned the Canadian officer who'd given him a coat, describing the incident as the moment when he began to question everything he'd been taught about enemies and allies, about racial hierarchies and democratic weakness. For Bauer, that coat became symbolic of a larger truth, perhaps the people Germany was fighting weren't the monsters propaganda portrayed. Perhaps Nazi ideology that justified total war was built on lies. And perhaps there were values worth learning from enemies who could demonstrate kindness when cruelty would have been easier. Henderson's gesture wasn't unique, but rather representative of a broader pattern in Canadian POW camps where individual acts of decency accumulated into a culture that treated prisoners humanely, even when regulations would have permitted harsher approaches. Canadian guards and officers regularly gave prisoners cigarettes from their own rations, shared photographs of families with prisoners who expressed homesickness, taught English to prisoners who wanted to learn, and intervened to protect prisoners from abuse by guards who occasionally let anger or prejudice override professional conduct. These small acts didn't make captivity pleasant. Prisoners still experienced the loss of freedom and the uncertainty about their futures, but they made captivity bearable and created conditions where prisoners could maintain dignity and hope rather than descending into despair or hardening into permanent hatred. Code itself had a continued life beyond that first encounter because Henderson never retrieved it from Bauer, instead requisitioning a replacement from camp supplies when they arrived. Bauer wore Henderson's coat through that first Canadian winter, the heavy wool keeping him warm during outdoor work assignments and becoming a visible marker of the incident that other prisoners knew about and discussed. The coat was too large for Bauer's slight frame, hanging loose in ways that made him look even younger than his 19 years. And it bore Canadian Army insignia that created strange visual dissonance. A German prisoner wearing an enemy officer's coat. Eventually, as more appropriate clothing became available and as Bauer was transferred to other camps, the coat was returned to camp supplies, but its significance persisted in stories prisoners told each other and in the example it set for how captors and captives could interact. The response from Henderson's fellow Canadian officers to his gesture ranged from approval to mockery, reflecting different attitudes about appropriate relationships with enemy prisoners. Some officers considered Henderson's action admirable, an expression of humanitarian values that Canada supposedly stood for and that distinguished democratic nations from fascist enemies. Others thought it was excessive, that providing adequate clothing through proper channels was sufficient, and that giving personal items to prisoners was inappropriate fraternization that blurred necessary distinctions between captor and captive. A few mocked Henderson as soft or naive, suggesting he'd been manipulated by a prisoner seeking special treatment. Henderson himself, in letters to his wife, preserved in provincial archives, expressed no particular pride in the gesture, describing it matter-of-factly as the obvious response to seeing another human being suffering from cold, noting that he'd have done the same for anyone regardless of nationality.